Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, so today we are diving into a concept that might honestly change the way you look at reality itself. I mean, we're going to tackle a pretty massive question here. Are our minds just, passive sponges soaking up the world, or are we actually the active architects of literally everything we perceive?
So, think about this. Is it text merely a simple mirror of its time? Because, let's be real, we do this all the time, right? When we pick up a historical document, a philosophy book, or a religious text, our brain instantly goes, okay, what was happening in the world back then? We treat the text like it's just a passive reflection of the past. But what if that whole approach is just a trap? What if reading it that way totally blinds us to what's actually happening?
And, well, that brings us straight into a super common reductionist myth. You've definitely heard people say religion is the opium of the people, where they call certain texts a placebo, right? This kind of mindset basically reduces these incredibly complex texts down to just psychological coping mechanisms for human misery. Or it frames them as deliberate roadblocks to revolutionary change. It's treating profound human thought as nothing more than a knee-jerk reaction to a miserable environment.
Okay, let's dive into this and really break it down. On one side of the ring, we've got what we call the naive view. This is the idea that your mind is basically a passive receiver, just taking in reality and bouncing it right back like a mirror. But on the other side, we have the modern, sophisticated view, the active mind. This is the mind acting as a creator and a judge. It doesn't just passively reflect things, it actively builds them.
Which leads us to part one, the illusion of the simple mirror.
So, this illusion is what we'd call a major epistemological obstacle, basically a giant flaw in how we understand how we know things. When you get caught in this trap, you end up reducing a beautifully structured text into a mere rhapsody. Like, you treat it as this chaotic, stitched-together Frankenstein of literary tropes from its era. You start thinking human thought is just a passive mirror of reality, and that any new text is simply borrowing a mishmash of older representations. It literally strips the text, and the author for that matter, of any real creative power.
A really fascinating example of this is how people often approach the Quran. See, because the Quran frequently references other religions of its time, as well as older faiths, it becomes this massive target for that naive mirror reductionism we just talked about. People will look at it and go, well, it's just reflecting the sociocultural environment of the 7th century. And by doing that, they wrongly dismiss its entire foundational structure, just reducing it to its historical context.
Moving on to part two, the two naive prejudices. Let's look at why we fall into this trap in the first place.
So this whole reductionist illusion is propped up by two massive, pretty baseless flaws. First up is the epistemology of adequacy. Now, that's just a fancy philosophical way of saying we walk around with the illusion that our human knowledge perfectly matches actual objective reality. But hold on, because right next to it is flaw number two, the ontology of the uniqueness of the world. This is the false certainty that the physical world we can see and touch is the absolute only world that exists, and that we somehow know everything about it. These two beliefs are basically the twin pillars holding up that broken mirror theory.
All right, part three, Kant's revolution. This is where everything shifts. Enter modern epistemology and the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He sparked a massive paradigm shift. Basically, human reason grew up. Modern epistemology completely rejects that idea of adequacy. We finally admitted our minds can't perfectly map out absolute reality. It also throws out that dogmatic claim about the world we see being the unique and only one. So what do we use instead? We rely on an intersubjective guarantee, which really just means our standard for objectivity isn't claiming we know the absolute truth, but rather that we've established rigorous, shared methods of understanding among all of us. So, the crucial point here is this. The old way assumed we just passively reflected the real, but Kant showed us that thought actually produces the object of its theoretical work. Your mind isn't just taking passive snapshots of the world. It is actively creating the methods and conceptualizing the objects it wants to study. It's a creative engine, not a reactive one.
Now, part four, the concrete and the theory. Let's ground this, because I know it sounds like some really heavy abstract philosophy.
Let's look at how this theory shapes our totally normal, everyday actions. Take the mathematical concept of bijection. Don't worry, we aren't doing actual math here. Bijection just means establishing a direct, one-to-one correspondence between two sets of things. What's absolutely crucial to grasp here is that a bijection isn't a physical object. You can't trip over a bijection in the woods. It is a pure invention of the human mind. It's a theoretical tool. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole point. Imagine a shepherd who has never read a math book in his life. He's totally illiterate. But to keep track of his flock, he uses a pile of little stones, calculs. For every single sheep that wanders out to graze, he moves one stone. He doesn't know the formal mathematical number of his sheep, but through that abstract theory of bijection, matching one stone to one sheep, he knows exactly if one is missing at the end of the day. Even the most practical, seemingly uneducated action relies on this deep, invisible abstraction created entirely by the mind.
So let's zoom out a bit. Think of your mind as a theoretical matrix filled with a bunch of empty boxes. Empirical reality, the physical stuff we actually see and touch, doesn't dictate our thoughts. It just provides the data, the variables, and the values that fill those empty boxes. The system itself, the whole arrangement, that is entirely a product of the theory created by your mind.
And honestly, this is so universally true that even the most hardcore empiricists, the folks who swear up and down that only physical, observable data matters, are totally trapped by it. I mean, even they have to use a theoretical vision just to classify things. They need theory for induction, and they need a theoretical framework just to define what an object even is. Empirical data alone literally never determines thought. It is always the other way around.
Because our active minds are doing all this heavy lifting behind the scenes, human thought systematically creates distinct sciences to frame and process our knowledge. We've got theoretical sciences, like theology and philosophy. We have practical sciences, like law and mysticism. And we have architectonic sciences, like tafsir or exegesis, which, by the way, perfectly ties back to our earlier example of analyzing the Quran. These are all just magnificent structures built by the mind to process the raw values the world throws at us.
Actually, as a quick but really important nuance regarding the religious texts we study, determining the absolute author behind a text, that's ultimately a matter of faith. It falls completely outside the bounds of strict philosophical knowledge. Philosophy is great for analyzing structure and epistemology, but it knows its limits when it comes to declaring absolute origins.
Finally, Part 5, Thought as a Judge. This brings us to the ultimate climax of Kant's revolution.
We've finally arrived at what it truly means to exist not as a mirror, but as a creator. Consider this. Thought is not a mirror reflecting reality, but it reflects the acts of thought itself. You are not just sitting there passively watching reality happen on a screen. Your mind is actively shaping your entire worldview. The structures, the categories, the judgments you make, they construct exactly how you interact with the universe. Thought is the judge that interrogates the real.
Which leaves us with a massive, kind of provocative question to wrap up on today. If your thought is the judge interrogating reality, what laws is it dictating today? What theoretical matrices are you using to organize the empirical data of your own life? Remember, you aren't just a mirror reflecting your environment. You are the active architect of your understanding. Keep interrogating reality, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.